and welcome to the MCS Strategic Analysis for the February 2020 sitting on Trevel Records. And I am Joseph Bowen with Astranti, and we are going to be looking at how the Trevel Records company and the wider music industry that was given to us in the pre-scene content for this sitting, how it relates to all our strategic models, how it can go about its business and be a success, and what kind of conditions it's working within. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was just an introduction to what we see briefly in the pre-scene. We see that we are talking about the music industry. It's very complex because we've got a lot of changing trends in both consumer demands and also what the industry is doing and what is successful in the industry. Trevel are a leading record label, and they focus on being quite innovative, having the best artists, developing them, taking their time to produce these global superstars of music. However, there is a decline in this segment of the market. Recorded music is not doing so well. It's recently been overtaken by live performances, for example, and there's a large amount of competition that is very strong on a similar level or greater. So it's an interesting business, and let's get stuck right in. So the first thing that we're going to discuss throughout this analysis is the rational model. This includes what we want the business to be, and then following all these things, such as the mission, objectives, governance, etc., we have to discuss about where the business is now. And that's where we've got our business environment with Pestel, 5 forces, value chain, and sort of the generic strategies that follow that derive from our mission and objectives. So we're first going to look at where the business wants to be, Trevel that is, where it is now, and then how it can go from where it is now to what it wants to be right at the end. So almost like a future, present, and then how kind of scenario. So the first step is to understand where the organization wants to be and what the aims are in terms of meeting stakeholder needs. So what we're going to look at first is the mission. What is it all about? Well, essentially, it is the reason for existence. And like I said, we haven't actually had as much overt knowledge on this kind of aspect in the pre-scene. We didn't get a dedicated page to the Trevel mission. However, Campbell did set out key elements of what makes a good mission statement, essentially why it exists. And the first thing is that you need to discuss the purpose. Why does it exist and for whom? What does it hope to achieve as a business? And following this, how will the organization compete with that in mind? Following that, once you've developed your strategy, you then have to discuss what the actual values of the business are, what they stand for, innovation, quality, or maybe going for a budget option. And then finally, you've got to have your policies, which are essentially ensuring that your company the people within your company act in a way that is focused on the values, strategy, and purpose of the entity. So, the balanced scorecard is a good way of identifying how we can go from what we want to be to actually being it as an entity. And this is because measuring the performance and understanding how everything is going based on these missions, strategies, objectives, etc. is paramount because it gives you a good idea of how that works. Now, some typical balanced scorecard aspects are going to be in these 4 different perspectives. You've got the financial, learning, customer perspective, and internal perspective. So in terms of a broad brush, you'll be looking at profit, return on investment, cash flow, and gearing. We know for sure that profit is declining for Trevel, which is obviously a very negative aspect in the financial sphere. In terms of learning, about training, hours spent on training, how good the quality recruits are, so that would be the musicians in this case. Employee utilization rates, so how often are we keeping our sound technicians working as opposed to idle. And in this case, it's not quite the same because it's not a production industry, but still you don't want people to be getting paid to do nothing. So that's essentially the idea there in the internal perspective. In terms of deliveries with our distribution, it's a little bit loose in regards to the music because we're looking about streaming and stuff like that. Employee satisfaction is going to be key because branding is a key interest of the company. We saw in the pre-scene throughout that it is a key critical success factor, and satisfaction amongst all employees, especially the artists, are going to be paramount. Investment in IT could be another option, or technology in general, and project management and how well we're doing that is a good internal perspective. And finally, the customer perspective is like complaints slash maybe bad reviews in regards to music, how many people we're selling to, how much of these services we're rendering, so how many artists are we signing, how many live performances are our artists booked for, and customer satisfaction in terms of reviews and popularity, again, links into this customer perspective. So we then have governance, how the company is actually governed to then carry out both these values, objectives, etc., and how it's going to be governed in a way of measuring performance. Essentially, who runs the show? And the corporate governance is that way of having the organization directed, administered, and controlled. And essentially, for example, you have this code of corporate governance for the UK, and typically this is what listed companies are going to be subject to as a requirement, give or take. And that will be a separate chairman and CEO, independent non-executive directors, audit nomination and remuneration committee, and disclosures of directors and pay, etc., financial reporting and control. So there's lots of things here, and good use of the annual general meeting. So this is where we can get across our core message to stakeholders, or shareholders rather, that wouldn't typically be involved in the day-to-day, but we can inform them of how things are going, etc. So applying governance to our case, we know that Trevel are quoted. That means they are duty bound to governance regulations based on their stock market listing. They also have a functional structure, which we discussed in the preceding analysis. Essentially, some of the pros are going to be that there is an expertise in each function because everyone knows where they are. They have the skills necessary for those functions. There's also key responsibilities based on functions. It's very clear who's responsible for which function. But some of the downsides is that you won't have any geographical expertise potentially if we're working across different borders, which we seem to be doing because we're a global company. And also that communication can go a bit off because you're typically not going to be working very closely. You're going to be in separate functions and maybe communicating at a less frequent interval. And that's where the CEO needs to really step up and make sure all the communication is correct. There's no mention of remuneration, nomination, or audit committees. So that's a potential avenue which could come up in the pre-scene, though to my mind, I'm not sure that it will be a big feature because we didn't really get any real hints on it at all, even though there was a lack of it. They do have several non-executive directors and a non-executive chairperson, which is fundamental. Essentially, they're following the governance regulations, and therefore I wouldn't suggest in this case there's anything to worry about for Trevel. So overall, very good in the governance aspects. From this, we have our ethics and CSR. And if you remember from the industry pack, or if you haven't seen that, essentially one of the key ethical issues was harassment or abuse from people within the record label to young artists or female artists. And essentially there's quite a high profile case now and then between, I think Taylor Swift has one and some others. And they're all very serious allegations that, are very horrible if true. And in this case, we need to make sure our branding is protected by not having these kinds of incidents. A, it's just wrong, of course, but B, it would be so damaging to the company for that to occur. So the key thing in this topic is that ethics often plays a key part in most exam variants, or at least in some way or another. And this is because there might be a specific ethical requirement, or simply that there's a small sort of element of the question that requires you to think a little bit ethically and about social responsibility. And it's because CIMA want to be seen to be testing that kind of stuff. So it does come up quite often. So how might Trevel have some key issues in this area? Well, the first thing is the treatment of musicians. I did reference the harassment aspects that have popped up in the real world industry before, but also in terms of how ethical the split of revenues is, because ultimately whilst the record label does invest a lot in musicians, there's definitely an aspect of, well, the musicians do create the music, so to some degree there has to be a pretty good split here. And if there's any sort of reports of a greedy split from the record label, there could be a serious sort of branding hit and ethical or unethical feeling around the company. There's also no CSR report, which suggests that it may come up, but also that it's just a bad idea not to have a very codified code of conduct. That doesn't make too much sense, but a codified CSR report would be very much clear on terms of how Trevel expects to treat its different stakeholders and what it's doing to help them. Finally, potentially the environmental footprint of the company versus the trends of vinyl sales and live performances. Both of these things look lucrative in terms of gaining extra revenues, but both have large footprints. So maybe we'd have to look at the environmental impacts of going into those different aspects a bit more heavily. Some other issues that are, a bit off key, a bit more niche. Bribery could be to do with some regulation bodies or something like that, and professional ethics in terms of how we're accounting and reporting, though these haven't popped up for quite some time. They're very, very oddball kind of topics that, whilst they're quite obvious, they don't really typically come up in the exam too often, but don't discount anything at this stage for sure. Next we have our critical success factors, and this is essentially the key things that Trevel would have to do to succeed on its mission, objectives, values, etc. It is therefore critical that each of these critical success factors for the organization is developed and improved, and those new strategies that may be discussed in the unseen have to support the CSFs, otherwise it's not something we can really recommend. Typically we have to highlight where the implementation of a strategy meets or does not meet our CSFs, because that is essentially what makes us successful. So essentially, if something in the unseen is contradictory to our critical success factors, then you should question whether they are appropriate. The following critical success factors are present for Trevel to my mind, and is that they need to have really strong branding and marketing campaigns in terms of how they approach it, and the overall brand image is critical. This is because you have to attract the best artists. The best artists want to have the best treatment, the best compensation split. They need essentially the best brand in terms of artists will get the best artists, and therefore those artists will build a roster that gives you more revenues. Even if you're giving up more money compared to other record labels, having more really good artists is going to be crucial. And again, that's where innovative artists comes in. To get the new big thing, you have to make sure that you are positioned as such as an appealing option to this stakeholder. Because it's not quite the same as an employee. If someone's super, super desirable, they will have multiple offers in this case. So, a budding musician who's really, really talented and is just being discovered, they may have 3, 4, maybe even more record labels trying to get them to sign. And therefore you need to be positioned as such. Stakeholder management in general is really, really important. We've got licensing bodies, we've got our artists, we've got our distributors. They all come around into a very critical sort of network where if we annoy or cause an issue with any of these factors, it could really harm revenues. For example, if, we fall foul of our licensing regulations, we could be in for a copyright lawsuit, which then damages the brand and their revenues. The same thing if we upset our key artists. They may leave after their contract expires and go to somewhere else. This may lead to new artists thinking we're not worth signing for as Trevel. And also our distributors may up the rates, may lower the rates at which they pay us for each play on the stream. And again, we need to make sure we have the best advances royalty split. It's linked to this brand image and attracting the best artists. We need to make sure we're an appealing option.
Hello, it's me again. I just wanted to take a few minutes of your time to first extend my hope that you enjoyed the free sample that you've just viewed, but also to just sort of explain what else a strategy do to help you pass your exams really effectively, provided you found our sample particularly interesting and insightful, of course. So, of course, we have a study text for every module, ranging from P1 to F3, and the certificate level is also free on our website. So we have study texts throughout the CIMA course, every module you could hope to study. The certificate level are free, as I mentioned, and then the rest of them, ranging from P1 to F3, are all available to purchase. Alongside this, if you're not so much a study text kind of student and you prefer a visual way of learning, we have the course videos. We essentially break down the study text into bite-sized presentations with a walkthrough, and it's a very, very, very engaging way of explaining the course. Following this, we have the pre-scene analysis, where we break down each pre-scene sitting into a number of videos, going through the whole document, but also adding a top 10 recommendations for what will come up in the exam, and also a strategic analysis where we put all the models you'd find in E2, for example, to the pre-scene itself, whichever that may be at the time. Alongside this, we provide an industry analysis. This is a document and accompanying video which help you give that contextual information in your exam. So for example, if the pre-scene is on the oil industry, the industry analysis will break down the oil industry, the current topics, trends, issues, what the competitive market looks like, all those kind of aspects, all condensed into one so you can spend your time wisely in your study period. Following on from this, when you actually want to practice all this knowledge, we have mock exams for all of our materials. So StudyText has a generic mock exam based on the module, whereas the pre-scene analysis has mocks available to purchase that are based on that specific pre-scene, that are targeted to the key issues we believe will come up. And if you're not content with just doing those mock exams and practicing that way, we have a marking and feedback system where you can purchase the ability to send in your paper, have it marked by a CIMA qualified accountant, and get personalized feedback on whether you can improve X or Y area. And sort of finally, if you will, if you're feeling really underprepared and that exam is coming really, really soon, the master classes are offered by Astranti, and they're essentially a crash course in anything you could want for that topic. So if it's a master class on the pre-scene, it's going to give you absolutely everything that you could possibly need to know about the pre-scene in one really condensed sitting. Likewise, if it was the F3 masterclass, you would have all of F3 gone through in a very crash course style presentation and video link. You can also purchase it post-stream as opposed to viewing it live, all these kind of aspects. We are very, very confident that these materials will help you get the exam success that you want. So we have a pass guarantee. Provided you fill out a form which demonstrates that you have utilized our materials to a large extent and actually taken the time to study them, and you have unfortunately failed, we will offer you the same materials again for the next sitting as a consolidatory offer to ensure that you can get back on the horse and get that exam grade that you want. With that said, thank you very much for watching the sample video. I hope you enjoyed it and it gives you a lot of confidence in Astranti and your CIMA future.